Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for being here. I'm going to be talking about Google's digital news initiative. And luckily for you, I won't be speaking for the whole hour. We thought it would be much more interesting if you listen to some people who are getting involved in what we're doing. So what I thought I would do is I would just very briefly give you an introduction to the Digital News Initiative, and then ask some colleagues who are working on it from different organizations to come up and speak about different parts to it. So that's how it's going to go. So there's going to be a few people coming up on stage, coming up, coming down. It may look a little bit rough around the edges, but just bear with us. Hopefully the conversation will be enough. So I'm also going to start a little timer on my watch to make sure that I don't talk too long. I'm a good Indian boy. We just like to talk a lot, so I will try and be as quick as I can. So the Google Digital News Initiative, or DNI. At Google, we like our acronyms, so we use TLAs a lot, three-letter acronyms, so I'll be saying DNI throughout this. DNI is effectively our framework for engagement with the European news ecosystem. I come from a news background. Before Google, I was at the BBC News, and before that, I was at Associated Press. And to be honest with you, one of the issues that I had with Google when I was at the BBC in particular is I found Google pretty hard to understand. It was a very big company. They did lots of very different things. When it came to news, they did lots of different products here and there. Often what they would do is they would always do experiments and things like that with American publishers. And despite my funny accent, I'm actually Indian and have lived the last 20 years in the UK. And so it always used to slightly irritate me that when they were doing interesting things with news organizations, they would start with the New York Times and the Washington Post. And we were hearing recently from a series of publishers in Europe that they felt that they didn't understand us well enough and that we should focus on a number of different areas when it came to the news ecosystem in Europe. And that, simply put, is how DNI came about. Publishers said to us, we want to have a proper framework for engagement with you, Google, and we'd like you to work in kind of three areas. And so today we're going to talk about those three areas in specific with people who are involved in them. But I wanted to just outline where they came from and what they are at the high level. So the three areas of DNI, the first one is product development. So what the publishers said to us was quite simply is that sometimes Google was difficult to talk to, right? And I have to say, kind of working in Google, I can understand that. Sometimes we are difficult to talk to. But what they said is that actually we're all part of a news ecosystem together. And if we can have a dialogue and collaborate, then perhaps we can co-create things that are good for everybody, good for users, good for the news ecosystem, good for technology, and hopefully good for all of us. And this actually, to be quite frank with you, is a little bit of a different way than Google was used to working. Quite often, Google can be a little bit of a black box. The brilliant engineers in Mountain View do some amazing things, and then all of a sudden they ship it over, and it gets developed that way. So under DNI, we're trying to create a very different framework for dialogue. And so we are having an ongoing conversation with the European news ecosystem about the challenges of that ecosystem. And a couple of people will talk about that more specifically. But very much I want you to take away that we are trying to listen and collaborate on the product level. And that's the heart of what we're doing under the product development dialogue. The second thing that publishers asked us about is really around kind of training and user research. I started in news over 20 years ago, and on a very basic level, it was much simpler back then. And now it's much more complicated. There are more access to information, more ways to news gather, more ways to tell stories, and it's very, very complicated. So publishers said to us, there are a lot of really interesting things that Google does and Google tools that are useful for working journalists, but they're all over the place. Can you actually explain these to us better? And therefore what we did is we created a team called News Lab. And they're actually ex-journalists, and they have compiled a lot of the tools that Google has that are really useful for journalists. And they go out into newsrooms and to other events and do trainings for journalists. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that means in reality. And just to touch a little bit on the user research, what we do under DNI is we are funding the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism, the digital news report that they do. Every year they come out with analysis about user behavior. I think this year they're going up to about 30 countries. and how in different countries people are consuming news in different ways. Their next report is out in the middle of June. It'll be announced at the Global Editors Network in Vienna. I think that's June 15th or 16th, so please keep an eye out for that. I always make a plug for the digital news report, because I think in news organizations, at least in my experience, often we operate from the gut. And the gut and instinct and kind of editorial sense is really useful. But I also, having worked at a technology company, understanding your users is very useful. So I think gut plus information is probably better than either of the two. And finally, the final third pillar of D&I is innovation. We heard very much that people talk about innovation, but actually innovation is very difficult. It's difficult to define, it's difficult to incentivize, it's difficult to measure. And publishers were saying to us, we have a day-to-day job that just is actually intense and is a grind. So they wanted a little help to try and stimulate innovation. So we created the D&I Innovation Fund. We've set aside 150 million euros over 3 years to give out as awards for projects. So these are very much awards, not equity, not investment, nothing to do with Google, but really just about stimulating that. And we're going to have one of the awardees come and talk about their experience. So that's D&I overall. If you can remember only one thing from what I said, just remember that D&I has 3 pillars: product, training and research, and innovation. And now what I'd like to do is to ask Max Rau from Spiegel to come up and talk a little bit about one of the things that we're doing around product. Max, thank you. So Max is from Spiegel. I'll let him introduce himself in a second, but the product that we wanted to talk about, the project that we wanted to talk about is about AMP, Accelerated Mobile Pages. So Max, would you like to introduce yourself? And, oh yeah, you need a mic.
Hi, yes, I'm doing editorial SEO at Spiegel Online, and yes, we are one of the first partners with AMP.
Great. For the audience, would you like to describe what AMP is?
AMP are basically HTML pages, which are way easier and way faster than the usual mobile page.
Great. And the way that AMP came about was that publishers like Spiegel were saying to us that this concept of distributed content, where you've got Facebook Instant Articles here, Snapchat Discover here, Apple News here, even Google Play Kiosk over here, it's quite complicated. And this was a way of trying to simplify that. So do you think it's going okay?
Yeah, our first experiences are very good. We have a small sample size because not every search query has AMPs activated, and we just have 2 months of experience. But our first experiences are very, very good because the users seem to acknowledge the higher speed with mobile pages.
And one of the things I've heard is people can be worried about producing this new type of HTML files, that it could be quite difficult, or all that kind of stuff. How have you found it? Be honest. Don't be nice just because I'm up here.
Actually, it's not too complicated. Our developers did a good job, and it's open source, and I think everybody can do AMP. So it's not too complicated. You have to have some experience, of course, but well, it's no rocket science.
Yeah. So that's a very good point. AMP is actually an open source project. It's not a Google project. So we're working out in the public with lots of parts of the news ecosystem. How has your experience of this as an open source project been? Have you been on GitHub? Have your developers been contributing?
Well, we haven't been right there from the start, but we joined soon after, and I think our experience there is good. And the open source aspect, I think, is growing. I think it's not too big right now, but it's growing, and it will be even bigger when AMPs are activated all over the place.
I think it's your definition of big. I think there's been over 3,000 publishers on GitHub, so if you want bigger than that, let's keep going. So please, I encourage you guys to all get involved. And what have you seen so far? You said it's a small sample size. I think it's only been, at Google, it's only on one small canvas, as we call it there. What has been your experience, both good and bad?
Well, actually, no bad experiences at all to this point, but when we have breaking news, for instance, when Prince died, we saw a lot of traffic coming through AMPs, way more traffic through the AMPs than through stationary and the other mobile side together. Well, it switched after, I don't know, 30 minutes, but the first traffic came through AMPs.
That's very interesting. And are you seeing other platforms using it? I mean, I know that as part of the project, both Twitter, LinkedIn, Pinterest, others are using it. Are you seeing any traffic from other platforms?
I can only see our traffic,
Yeah.
and there's just the traffic we create through AMP. I see a lot of different platforms and news portals using it, but I can't say anything about their traffic.
And the final question really about the analytics side of it. So how is it the analytics working? You work in editorial SEO, so you want to know what's happening. Are you getting enough information back from from the protocol?
Yeah, it's pretty easy. It's just the same with our stationary side. I use Google Analytics for it, and it's no problem at all, the implementation.
Great. So if you had final words about AMP to the crowd, what would you say to them?
I think it's a great thing for the internet and for all users, because the mobile pages, we know that they can be like slow and it's not loading properly. And with AMP, you don't have any of these problems. So it's a great thing for the internet, and not just only for us as a news site, but for everybody.
Great. Thank you very much, Max. Thank you. We're going to take questions afterwards as well, so we'll all be up here to answer any questions. But the second kind of idea that came up via DNI and the product was one of the challenges that publishers are saying to us is that cyber attacks had been increasingly growing, and this was a difficult thing for them to deal with. And we have a part of Google called Google Ideas, which is now called Jigsaw, and they'd worked on some things to help news organizations about that. So to explain a little bit more about this, I'd like to ask George Conard from Jigsaw to come up and to tell us a little bit about Project Shield. So Project Shield, for those of you who don't know, is the project at Google that has the coolest name. But to tell you a little bit more about what it actually is, George, please.
I don't know about that. I was thinking we could with AMP, maybe we need to adopt the tagline, making mobile great again.
There we go.
Like that. So Project Shield really started, as Madhav said, as we've done a couple of things, both looking at digital attacks globally on the internet, and a particular type of attack, which I'll talk about in a minute, and talking to news publishers and journalists about the problems that they're having in making sure that their readers get access to the articles that are being done. We all depend on the news and on journalists to tell us what's happening in the world around us, to help us understand that, in a lot of cases to do investigative journalism, to really uncover the truth of what's underlying a particular topic or an event. And in the past, silencing the news really required acts of physical violence. So you'd have to go and break into a publisher's office, you'd have to smash a printing press to stop the news from getting out. Today, though, with digital attacks, it's much, much easier to silence the news. And there's a particular type of attack called a DDoS attack, or a distributed denial of service, that we see as a growing threat to really the entire internet, but particularly to news organizations. For those who don't know or haven't seen it before, a DDoS attack, distributed denial of service, way easier to say DDoS, another good acronym to pull in, is when an attacker sends so much traffic toward a website that no one else can get to it. And there's a lot of technical detail underneath that, but one of the easier ways to think about it is, imagine that you were having a birthday party for one of your friends, and you invited 10 close friends to come to it. But someone who doesn't like you, or doesn't like that friend you're having the party for, finds out about it, and they invite 10,000 other people to come to it. And all of a sudden, all of the streets around the venue where the party is going to be held are jammed up with traffic. No one can actually get to it, the people who are invited, because all of the streets are jammed. The venue just simply can't handle the load. That's the basic idea of what a DDoS attack is. And as I've talked to people, whether it's an investigative journalist in Angola or large news organizations in Europe, anywhere around the world, they are seeing more and more attacks happening to the point where you might have an attack happening every day, big attacks happening every couple of months. We've seen in countries like Sweden, multiple papers go down on the same day due to coordinated attacks. And it's something that Part of the reason it's becoming a growing problem is because it's becoming easier and easier to launch these kinds of attacks. So any of you could go out on the internet today, and if you know the right places to look, hire someone for under 100 euros to launch an attack against someone. So you see an article published that you don't like, you even see a comment in a comment thread that you don't like, and you can launch an attack against that. So Project Shield is really our attempt to try to help protect news organizations from these kinds of attacks. And the insight that we had is that we at Google have built a lot of very good defenses against these sorts of attacks, and we have a lot of capacity to absorb a lot of traffic. And so Project Shield really acts exactly what it sounds like, as a shield between the attackers and the news publishers. The way that it works, it's something called a reverse proxy. And what that means is that when a user enters a URL into their browser, before going to the server that is hosting the content, it first comes through Project Shield. We're able to analyze it, determine whether or not it's an attack or not. If it's an attack, we block it. And if it's a legitimate user request, we'll pass it through to the original server, get the content, and pass that back to the end user. And in that way, protect particularly servers that may not have the capacity to absorb these kind of attacks from going down, and keep them up so that the news is available to the readers when they need it the most. We often see when physical events or events are happening in the physical world, whether they're political or conflict or something like that, attacks on the news go up, and that's exactly when their readers need to be able to get access to it. So our goal is to help make sure that all of the world's news organizations are protected. And we announced a couple of months ago in Paris that Google is making Project Shield available for free to all of the world's news organizations. So anyone who wants access to it can get it. And so if there are news organizations or journalists in the room, you're interested in it, or you know someone else who might need Project Shield, you can go to g.co/shield, and there's a lot more information, as well as the application form there for people to be able to sign up. Thanks.
Thank you. So just a few questions from my side. You described the reverse proxy. Does that sounds like a slow process, right? You got to go somewhere else. Does it slow it down?
It actually doesn't, and it's, I'm going to give you the simple answer, which is essentially no, okay. And the more complicated answer, which is it depends a lot on the publisher's current infrastructure. So for example, we see a lot of publishers who come on and they have, if they're small or medium-sized publishers, have a relatively small server or limited bandwidth connection. By coming onto Project Shield, often their site will increase in speed because the traffic is running across Google's internal network, and because as part of our DOS mitigation and the defenses that we have in place, we also do content caching. So in a lot of cases, that request from the end user can come to us. We can serve it out of cache much more quickly than if it had to go all the way to the origin server.
And the other question that I've got asked about this is, you said you detect it, you say who's the bad guy and who's the legitimate traffic. Mm-hmm. How confident are you that you can make that distinction and you're not denying legitimate users access to the site?
Yeah, so there are, again, simple and complicated answers to this, and I'll leave the technical ones. If people want to talk about them, come to the booth and ask about it afterwards. We have not yet had we've been doing Project Shield in some capacity or another for about 3 years now. And to my knowledge, we've not had a single false report or a report of a false positive of somebody getting blocked when they shouldn't. And in fact, the different types of attacks that happen, particularly ones that are happening at the network layer, which is the really, really big attacks where somebody's sending hundreds or usually in the hundreds of gigabits per second of just pure network traffic at someone, those are very easy to detect. Those don't look like false positives. There are some types of attacks that look more like legitimate user traffic, but we've been able to start putting some interesting fingerprinting and different things in place to be able to identify those and make sure that all of that legitimate traffic is going through.
Great. Thank you very much, George.
Thanks.
Thanks. So to talk about the second pillar of DNI around training, I'm going to ask Leah Steinacker and I'm going to pronounce this really terribly, Wirtschaftsbocker, to come up. I apologize for my pronunciation. Thank you, Leah. So the training that you've done with Google and the News Lab team, can you just give us a sense of what you've been doing and how useful it's been? Just tell us all about it.
Sure. So I'm Lea Steinacker. I'm the digital scout at Vivo at the Wirtschaftswoche, and we actually invited Isa Sonnenfeld, the director of the News Lab, to come into our newsroom. And basically, we had her come over twice because there was so much to learn. We had her come in and work with all of our editors, with the whole newsroom, and she introduced us to all the various tools. So we had a look at Google Trends and how to use that to do topic discovery in the mornings. We looked at Google Public Data Explorer and had a look at how to use those data sets, to visualize them, to use them for stories, to have input for news stories, and to get some explanatory background. We had a look at Google Maps and how to integrate those into our stories and articles, and how to sort of individualize them for our design, our look. And we had a look at Google Earth, which was actually, I think I can say, the most helpful so far, especially because a lot of newsrooms don't have video footage of, say, a flight over a certain city where something happened, or detailed street view looks at certain buildings that might occur in a story. So, for example, we used Google Earth after the Brussels attacks, and basically by the end of the day had, as a magazine who obviously didn't have instant representation in Brussels, we were able to use Google Earth to have a flight over the city. We looked at all the various locations of the attack, added some visuals, and by the end of the day had a fantastic explanatory video. So that was very helpful.
Great. And I've worked in newsrooms before, and newsrooms have some interesting culture, shall we say. How have your journalists been in terms of receiving the training? Because I remember when I was a journalist, I hated training.
Right, well, so I will say, I think there is still some hesitation, especially with a large company such as Google, to just sort of use those tools for journalistic purposes. So a few editors were hesitant, but I think actually the live meeting with people from Google and the workshops themselves, they actually really helped to overcome some of that, some of the skepticism, some of that hesitation. We have a little innovation unit at Vivo called the Vivo Lab, and so they actually were the ones afterwards driving the impetus to actually use those tools. So they are now trying to help other editors who might still, the older editors who might still feel a little bit left behind. So I think that might actually be a good idea for the DNI also, to have certain people in each newsroom who they could specifically train to then sort of further, those workshops, and to keep the training going. Because sometimes even, all the wonderful tutorials, all the YouTube videos, because there are a lot actually on the Google News Lab website, there are all these tutorials, but sometimes there's still, I think, just fear that even after taking or looking at all of those videos, you still can't do it yourself, and you can't do it fast enough when news are moving quickly. So I think having maybe certified trainers in newsrooms would be great to build up that.
Thank you. And you talked a little bit about Google Trends. Just to give some people some background on Google Trends, this is, if you don't know it, it's where you can go and see across country and at different levels how people are doing searches. And actually, one of the things that the News Lab team took as feedback was Google Trends was really interesting, but the problem with Google Trends a little while ago was that the information was 24 hours old. So from a news perspective, it was, I think the technical term is useless. And so they actually worked with the product team to try and make it real time, and now it is real time, and you can cut it at lots of different levels. Have you found people are using that in your newsroom?
In fact, yes, we have used Google Trends, although I will say also here, one idea would be, there's a fantastic Google Trends example, I think it was The Guardian. They basically worked with you guys together to have a look at how people in Great Britain were asking on Google about the referendum, the British referendum. And then they had this list of 10 questions that were asked a lot, and then they were able to answer those in their articles. But as far as I understand, that's not possible yet for newsrooms to do themselves, to have a look at how people are Googling about these things. So you can have a look at, the rate, the frequency of Google requests in general, but not really, in detail. I think that would be great for us to understand what people are still lacking in their understanding of various topics. So that would be great. But yes, we are using Google Trends. Yeah. So just fascinating little tidbits of the Google universe, such as the fact that in December there's a spike in people Googling the word God, and then in January people are Googling how to lose weight. So diets go up in January. But stuff like that sometimes gives you ideas for stories and for sort of data comparisons.
Yeah, just a quick point about the Guardian one, which I found interesting. One of the things around the election in the UK was they found that people were Googling, what does austerity mean? And it was very interesting in that because everybody in the news media was using this word all the time. But actually what was happening is that there was a vast audience that actually didn't know what they meant. So sometimes I think it's a good way you can use trends to find out, actually, are people understanding things that you already assume? They were also Googling how tall all the candidates were, but I don't know what that's about. But The Guardian actually did use that too. And if there's any feedback, you've given us some pieces of feedback. Any other feedback you'd like to give us?
Sure. Well, so I think you can work a little bit more on transparency in terms of explaining to people how this DNI really is maybe separate from the large Google complex, or why, where this, this desire to help journalists come from, so that people are actually open to working with these tools. And then maybe some more freedom to individualize all the tools. So for example, in Maps, to be able to make our own map background so that it doesn't all look similar to the Google Maps design and feel. Google Earth, same thing here. Help us basically visualize the Google Earth videos more, so that we can each have our designs in there, so that we that we don't feel like we'll all end up looking the same, basically. So I think a little bit more freedom in these tools and a little bit more transparency would be great. And the trainers within newsrooms, I think, would be fantastic.
Great.
Yeah. One more thing, speaking about innovation and the News Lab and collaborating with them, we're actually collaborating with the News Lab in June to have a hackathon. So this will be a hackathon by Wirtschaftswoche and the Handelsblatt. So if anyone here is interested, it's happening in Düsseldorf on June 9th until the 11th. And we're still looking, we only have a few spaces left, but we're still looking for some designers and developers, journalists, anyone interested. There'll be a lot of virtual reality. There's a virtual reality prize. There are chatbot groups, etc. If anyone's interested, go to vivo.de/hackathon. So vivo like the Wirtschaftswoche.de/hackathon. We would love to see you there.
Great.
And that's with the Google News Lab as well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Just before I introduce the next participant, I actually want to just pick up that point on transparency, because I probably should have said that on in my intro. One of the questions we get asked a lot is, why is Google doing DNI? And I think there's probably two levels to that question. The first level, I think, is quite simple in that Google and the news industry, in my opinion, share a lot of the same values, whether that's access to information, the fact that an informed citizen makes for a better society, that actually there's a lot of things that we can collaborate on together because we actually share a lot of the values. And I think, to be honest with you, sometimes we get a bit embarrassed talking about values because it can sound a little cheesy. But I think it's important to understand that Google is a company that has those values that are very common with the news industry. I think the second point, really, the higher order point, is that actually, I think we understand that we're now all part of a news ecosystem. And I use the word ecosystem in particular because it means that each part is dependent on each of the other parts. And I think what's happening in the news industry is we're going through an amazing era of opportunity and disruption. And that it can be incredibly challenging, and that actually what we're seeing is that greater collaboration between organizations is how we develop. My standard little joke is that this has never been a more competitive time for news. You have newspapers competing with broadcasters, with radio, with digital only. Everybody's competing for your attention, and we're all losing to Candy Crush, right? And the reality is that it is a much more complicated world that we live in, and it is a news ecosystem, and that to all be relevant to all our users out there, I think that we need to collaborate together. And so DNI, one of the reasons that we're doing DNI is that we want to have a better framework to collaborate together. And to be completely honest with you, we don't know where DNI will go, right? We're not really focused on the outcomes. What we're trying to do is put a process in place, a framework together, so that we can have a dialogue and work together on different things that hopefully will be innovative, good for users, good for publishers, and good for the ecosystem overall, and also potentially good for Google as well. But we think that we're an ecosystem that works together. So there we go, a little bit of that, and I'm happy to take questions during the Q&A session about that as well. But I'd like to shift gears and talk about the third part of DNI, innovation. And to do that, I'm going to ask Max, and I'm not going to try, Max, your last name, because I'll say it even worse than the news organization that Leah works for. Max works for Spectrum, and he is part of the one of the awardees from the DNI Innovation Fund. So if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself and just saying a little bit about your experience, that would be great.
Thank you. Hello, I'm Max. I'm one of the founders of Spectrum. And a year ago, right after Republica, we came up with the idea that it's probably a really good idea to distribute content to the apps which the people are most using and where the people spend most of their time on. And that are instant messenger apps like WhatsApp and so on and so on. So we started to distribute content from publishers there. We started with WhatsApp, we were doing Telegram, we were doing Slack. That's how we got into the Next Media Accelerator. And what we found out is that people are very interested in that, very engaged with getting content directly into their instant messenger, like WhatsApp or the Facebook Messenger, for example. But they also want to really interact with the publisher. It's not only about receiving content, it's also about engaging really with the publisher, asking questions and so on. So that's how we came up with the idea and the need of building a chatbot, a really smart chatbot, because instant messaging is a one-to-one communication. So if you have more than 100,000 users there and you won't try to reach out to them, it's impossible for a publisher to talk to all of these users. So we said, okay, we need a very, very smart chatbot, an AI-driven chatbot. And we said, okay, that's very hard to do. That's where we need support with special people, very experienced in AI and natural language processing. That's why we applied for the DNI funding. And yeah, we got the nominee or the award somehow, and that's why we're doing this right now, why we are able to do this, and we're running upfront the whole development, I think, in the world. We were just launch partner of at the F8 conference.
So I want to talk to you a little bit about the process of the DNI fund, just to explain that to everybody. But I'd like to talk a little bit about Spectrum itself. So in terms of, I've been hearing a lot about chatbots, and I think CNN was building one, and Quartz had one. So what do you think about the other chatbots that are out there?
I think all the chatbots from big publishers were just announced as at the Facebook Developer Conference F8 3 weeks ago. We're showing how the way is going, or how we will receive messages or content in the future, because it's much more personal. I can interact with the publisher. I think that's very exciting to do, but that is just the beginning, because right now chatbots are not smart. They just, it's very basic computer science. You put in something, you ask for a certain word, and you get the answer for that, or you have callback functions in there. So that's very easy. But to put in there artificial intelligence is very, very difficult. That's why we applied for Google, because if you're doing this, you need stimulation from other people there, and that's why we did this. I think it's just the start, and CNN also shows that is just the start.
And your own collaborations with news organizations, how have they been? Are people open to these ideas? What do you you've got publishers in the audience. What would you like from them?
I think there are two things so every publisher is really excited about this, because it's obvious people spending more time on instant messengers than on social media apps. The instant messenger apps have more users in general than social media has, so it's very interesting to use. Also in emerging markets, it's very interesting to use because they don't have so much data. So if I can open up the world for their only WhatsApp data packages, for example, in the Middle East, for example, if I can, so they're able to connect with family and friends there. If I'm able to connect with these people over instant messenger, I'm opening up the world of news for them right after they open up WhatsApp. So I think that's a great chance to do. It will change completely how we will receive news. We don't need any apps anymore, and we don't missing out on the Facebook timeline, the articles I'm interested in.
Great. So let's talk a little bit about the DNI fund. For those of you who don't know, we opened the window for the first round of funding at the end of October. Spectrum were one of 128 projects that we awarded. I'm happy to say today that the second round, the second window will open the first week of June. So any projects you have, please start thinking about that. But let's just talk a little bit about the process. So, some people might be worried about how difficult the process was. Do you want to talk about how it was for you from your side? Be completely honest, and we're looking for feedback too.
Yes, so the process was honestly quite easy if you have a very clear idea in mind of what you want to do and why this idea you want to give to you and send in is spectacular, it's innovative, and so on. If you have this clear idea, it's very easy to do this application because it's really not rocket science. It's not much you have to write down. The only downside was that it was a Google form, so I had to put in everything on one time and could not really save the application between. But I think that's a problem you could fix very fast.
And just to give people a sense of this is, the application form is, it's a 3-page form. How long did it take you to fill out, even though you weren't able to save and go back to it? Did this take you weeks? Did it take you, days, hours? How difficult was it to kind of fill out and do?
I think for us, we needed 2 weeks. The first week was just about the concept, to be very sure, very precise about what we want from you and how we will make this feasible, measurable, and so on and so on. So that was the first part. But after we had this, I think it was 2 days writing down all the notes you need to get the idea of our idea. That was the first step, and then the numbers. What is a milestone there? What is, I don't know, how we will make, if we want to, how we will make money if we want to, and so on. So that's, but also 2 days, so 5 days, and we were done after we had a very precise idea of what we want.
And then after you sent your application in, then what happened? Just explain a little bit of the process so people understand what happens after that.
Then we were waiting for a few weeks, and then we got, they reached out to us, had a call with us to get a better sense of our idea. They had a few questions to us, but it was just a normal Hangouts call for 30 minutes or something. Then it was fine, and then we got the note. Yeah, you're part of the DNI of the first round, and we're very, very happy about this.
Yeah, sorry about the waiting. I think just to be completely honest, we were overwhelmed with entries. We got 1,236, I think, which was probably twice as many as we had the resources to handle. So that's why there was a bit of a waiting period. But we also wanted to make sure that every project was looked at both by somebody in Google and outside of Google. We have a very strict diligence process about how this is completely independent. And one of the points I'd like to kind of reinforce is that all the projects, the intellectual property, the IP stays with you. The confidentiality, whether you want to be public or not, stays with the project owner. And I think that process that we're going through, to be completely honest with you, as the Ludovic Blecher, who runs the fund, he feels like we are prototyping the fund as we go, as we go along. So. What tips would you give to anybody in the audience for the second round, which is going to open up at the beginning of June?
So the first one is definitely apply for that because you can't lose. That's very easy. You won't lose equity, as you said before. It's support. It's connecting with very smart and great people, and it's probably a lot of money. So I think you should definitely apply for that. And yeah, I think. More tips I don't have, just write down a very precise idea of what you have and why it has a huge impact on the news ecosystem we have here in Europe, and I think then you have good chances to be part of it.
A few more tips from me, if I may, which is, I think, as Max was saying, being very, very specific is very useful. Having the KPIs where you know what you're doing, the milestones is very good as well. And to think about it from an innovation perspective, not just modernization. There's an amazing amount of creativity out there. Like I said, we had 1,236 in the first round. I suspect we'll get a little bit more than that in the second round. And so therefore, the kind of competition is very high. But we encourage all of you to apply because we think this is overall good for the news ecosystem. So thank you very much. What I'll ask, if that's all right, is I'll ask everybody else who is up here to come on stage, and maybe we'll take some questions if we have them. Thank you. Now, I insist that somebody ask a question because we got them all up on stage, and so if we have silence, it's going to be very embarrassing. So please, someone help us out and ask the first question. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for the interesting insights. My name is Torsten. I work as a digital business manager for a parenting media website at Gruner & Jahr. And I wonder, concerning AMP, what's the difference compared to Facebook instant articles? And are there any adaptations we as publishers need to make to our templates, and especially to the ad slots we want to distribute?
So I can talk about it from a concept, and then Max, maybe you want to talk about it in detail, if that's all right. I think the one big difference that I would say as the non-technical person is that Facebook Instant Articles is a hosted inside their platform site, whereas AMP is just a form of HTML that's open and different. In terms of the specifics, I don't know enough about Instant Articles to be able to speak. Max, could you help out?
I think that's about it. The open source aspect of AMP is the difference between those two. I'm also not the technical person at our company for SEO, so I can't go too much into detail. But one part that was very important for us was our own ads in the AMPs, and that was no problem. So I think that's probably what you wanted to know.
Yeah, that's good news, actually.
Yeah. And I think, again, because it's an open source initiative, at least from the AMP side, please go to the AMP webpage, the AMP website, AMP project, or the GitHub, and you'll see all the specs for the ads. And again, because it's open source, if you don't like what you see, get involved, help the thing develop. This is the very beginning of AMP. And one of the people on AMP said this is about the leadership of many. So if you see something that you don't like on AMP, don't complain about it, get involved. We have a question over there.
Hello, my name is Thomas. I also have a question about AMP. The question basically is, why do we need it? Can't we just make simple HTML pages instead of like big bloated HTML pages even on mobile like we have today? Isn't this more like WAP, if you remember that?
I think that's a great question. I think from our perspective, well, yes. Everybody could have made the simple pages, but it wasn't happening. And because it wasn't happening, what we were hearing from publishers is that other things were developing in terms of distributed content to kind of solve the problem that could have been solved before. But the reason that I think that it needed to come together in this open source nature is there's so many different dependencies. From a content management system, to the publisher, to the analytics, to the paywalls, all of that, to the ad tech companies. So that in individual parts, everyone was doing the right thing, but when you aggregated it and put it all together, it became those heavily bloated pages. So by bringing us all together sort of under the umbrella of an open source initiative like AMP, hopefully we can all create it together. And again, because it's open source, you can do it in the way that you want. So it would have been lovely that it wasn't a problem that we had to solve, or that it wasn't a problem to start with. But I think if we work together, then we can help make it better. And hopefully it'll be better than WAP. I think there's one just down here. Yeah. And over there as well.
So I have a question for you, actually. So why are you, as Google, doing all this? Out of the goodness of your heart?
That, and also, as I said, I think that we felt, to be completely honest with you, that we had been misunderstood, and that we've always felt like we're a positive part of the news ecosystem. But the way that we had operated before, which I think was a very technology-based approach of different products in different areas not talking to each other, wasn't as effective as it could have been. And like I said, we're all part of this news ecosystem. And therefore, we felt that if we come together and do D&I, which is this framework for acting together and collaborating, that it'll be better for everybody. So, being completely direct, AMP, one of the things about AMP is that it is open, right? And that's a good thing. Google's business model operates under things being open. So if everything went into closed worlds, it wouldn't be good. But the reality is it also is really good for publishers and users if things are in the open as well. So we're trying to do this in a way that benefits everybody across the piece. and out of the goodness of our hearts too. I think there was a question. If someone's got the mic,
Hi.
yes.
You talked a lot about the benefits. Could you be a bit more precise in terms of metrics, or what got better in terms of numbers?
You mean about AMP?
Yeah.
Yeah. So if I remember the metrics around AMP, some of the things that I saw, and somebody in the front row will probably correct me, I think we saw, I think it was something like, it was either a 10 times increase in speed and a 4 times decrease in bandwidth, or maybe the other way around. But I think that what we've been hearing from publishers is that, even though it's in a very small sample size right now, that the traffic is kind of neutral to positive, and that actually, interestingly, the monetization and the click-through rates are higher than the previous non-AMP mobile pages traffic. And in terms of kind of numbers that we're seeing, the last stat that I saw was that there were like 100 million AMP documents out there from 500,000 domains. So again, this is just the beginning stages of this, but it's building up quite well. And I think increasingly, as we see different platforms adopting it, Twitter, for example, has it in Twitter Moments. They're thinking about expanding that out. Pinterest has it. LinkedIn is using it. If you use the social news aggregator Nuzzle, which is pretty cool, I like Nuzzle, big plug for Nuzzle, they use it as well. So I think we're at the beginning stages of this. But again, like from the user's perspective, just try it out. Look at the speed, and I think you'll see the benefit there. We have one right there.
So my question is basically also more general. Google getting into news. Obviously, when you're thinking about Google, you've got you connect it with like lots of data about people. It becomes apparent when you talk about things like Google Trends. So my question is basically about the future of news. Is it going to be more personalized? Is that a goal that Google is, following or trying to?
So I think I'll talk a little bit about Google, and I'll talk about at least some of the things that I personally observe. I think from Google's perspective, I think what we try to do is stay core to our mission about making the world's information universally accessible and useful. And I think that ends up being around what is useful to that person in that moment, in that time. Again, being very respectful and around privacy and all that, and you have total control over all that. I think one of the things that I observe, and I'd love other people on the panel to talk about this, but one of the themes that came out in the Innovation Fund was there were a lot of projects that were looking at personalization. And I think what I see is that we're in a world where the user has all the power, right? And I think you're going to see increasingly personalization. I don't know if you guys want to talk about personalization in some of your organizations, or not. Maybe not.
So we actually are also part of the DNI fund. We have a project called Vivo Pro, and it goes sort of along those lines, but it's more about expert knowledge being curated for you by an automated crawler. So if you're interested, it'll come out soon. But I think with information, it's a little bit dangerous to think of it only as, or to think of personalized information as only positive, because we do end up having a sort of silo of information, whereas if many other aspects of the internet, I think, can be in a positive way, can be sort of sorted for you, and it makes it a little more usable, actually, if things are individualized. When it comes to information, though, I think we're missing out on a whole lot of serendipitous information and inspiring, thought-provoking, controversial stuff if we only look down one path, which I think personalized information kind of leads us to do. So when it comes to the news, I'm kind of a fan of making sure that serendipity doesn't get lost in the mix.
Yeah, so I'll pick up on that and just give an unsolicited plug for another one of our projects called Unfiltered News, and it's exactly what it sounds like if you want to go check it out online. It's unfiltered.news. And the idea with unfiltered news is, as you said, and a lot of times we'll get into a bubble or a silo of only seeing what's around us. So what we're trying to do with unfiltered news is show what are the top news topics in every country around the world and let people go and explore that so that you don't only see what's in the news in Germany or for me in New York or something like that, but see people in Turkey are talking about this particular topic or something else. It's a pretty cool visualization. Go around, play with it. It's out in beta. It's really an experiment to see how we can help people escape those bubbles.
Yeah, I think that I would recommend unfiltered news. I think the final point I would make on that is that I think it's really important, exactly what Leah said there, which is that you don't go 100% personalized. I think if I personalized a news app to be 100% for me, it would all be about Liverpool Football Club, right? And perhaps there are other things in the world, maybe less important. But I think there's a point about what the balance is, right? How do you balance it so you do get something that's completely relevant to you, but that also keeps the serendipity, and I would probably say, just on a personal level, also the expertise, right, that you have from news organizations.
Thanks.
Another question back there.
Thanks. Now one question on Project Shield. What's the economic rationale for you behind that? Because I love the notion of values, especially in the personal realm, but in the business context, I tend to wonder what the business model is behind that. Yeah. So how do you benefit from it, and do publishers pay for the service, or what's the...
Yeah, so Project Shield is a free service, and I think to get to the question, which I think is a good one, talking a little bit about Jigsaw, which is the technology incubator that I work for inside of Google, is useful. Jigsaw, which started as Google Ideas, was really set up. It was started by Eric Schmidt, who brought in our founder, Jared Cohen, to really think about how can we help protect vulnerable populations around the world as they're entering the online era. And Madhav mentioned part of Google's core mission is to make the world's information useful and accessible. And so for us, our business thrives when there's a healthy internet. Going out and figuring out how can we get DDoS out of the game, particularly as people trying to access information like the news, is part of contributing to the health of the internet. But Jigsaw's core mission really is, not to have an economic interest, but to really go out and identify very specific problems for very vulnerable users who nobody else is going to tackle. And we have, I think, the benefit and the freedom to be able to go out and do that, and not go, all right, how are we going to connect this back around to a revenue model or something like that. So it is something that is freely available to news organizations, human rights websites, elections monitoring sites, but that's really it. So there is no kind of commercial intent going beyond that.
May I add one more? Because I just thought if you check all the traffic that's going to a site and bypass it, so to say, you would have the opportunity to get amounts of data, huge amounts of data. And I mean, that's the usual thing you think about Google. Okay, then there's the data again, and then there comes the money. So
right. I mean, so you're right. The way that a reverse proxy works is the traffic comes through, the fleet of virtual machines that we have running that do the defenses. We've put a privacy policy in place around Shield where that log data is not shared anywhere else inside of Google. So we've essentially walled it off in a very, very strict way inside of the company, so that we're not using it for other purposes, really just for the purpose of mitigating the types of attacks that are happening.
Thank you.
Yep.
Hi there. I'd like to ask the young gentleman on the right how much of a project you already developed when you applied, and the other way around, I imagine you get applications that sort of span from great visions to projects that are really ramped up and almost ready to go, and how this would influence the selection criteria and the selection process. I mean, do you look at potential impact or feasibility?
I'll answer that bit first, if that's right. Yeah, so we look at both, right? Actually, we look at feasibility, we look at impact. We also look at what we call, relativity. So, what might be innovative for. I'm not going to pick on any small country, but a small country may not be innovative in the United Kingdom or in Germany, but actually that, so that's important to us as well. I think that, from almost the structural perspective, this is not really about paying for stuff you've already done, This is really about trying to go for stuff that you're going to build and build it out. But maybe you want to talk specifically, Max.
Yeah, for our example, it is like, if you want to build a very smart chatbot, you need two things. The one thing is you need the distribution software, which is pushing out the right content to the right person. That's the first thing. The second part is the pull factor. That's the push, and the pull, you need to pull. If you get requests, what are you doing with that? And we were at a state where the distribution software is completely set up, and we have the pull factor is somehow hard-coded. But if you want to put artificial intelligence on top on that, that's what we do with the Google money actually. So we had the basement was set there, but to get it really, really interesting and a very useful product with for millions of users, for example, you need the AI, and that's what we're building together with Google. So maybe you have right now a clue where our status was.
Yeah, my final point is, don't let anything you've heard here not make you apply, right? I think that just the application process. I mean, there was a great Medium article actually that one of the awardees wrote about how the application process actually just helped them, right? In terms of affirming their thinking and getting things out there. So we encourage everybody to apply. And if I hadn't mentioned it, first week of June is when the window opens. I think we've got a few more minutes. There's a question over there, which may be the last question, unless there's a burning, burning question. If you have a burning, burning question, put your hand up. But that may be your last question. No pressure, last question.
Okay. I have a question to the colleague from Wirtschaftswoche. Sorry, I don't remember. Lea. I'm also a journalist, and I also like to read Wirtschaftswoche, Handelsblatt, your publications. I'm wondering, I mean, you're a news outlet that also is supposed to report on businesses, obviously economics, and you're very much involved with a big company like Google, and you also said that you receive funds from them for a certain project. Do you think you can still supply your readers with independent reporting about this company? Do you make that transparent that you're so involved with this company? Because when I see all this and then you're sitting on a panel and advertising their services, I don't know if you can still report on this company, for example.
So I guess two different aspects. So number one, the fund is the same fund that we're talking about here, right? So that's I think a lot of German organizations, news organizations, did apply and are using this fund money, which by the way is not connected to any kinds of rights being written over to Google. It is a full sort of grant. There's nothing afterwards that Google is participating with us on. So that's number one on the fund. There's no connection to Google after the funding for this project. But on the tools, I mean, number one, they're out in the open anyway, right? So even without the Google News Lab having come into our newsroom to teach us how to use them, they were out on the internet before. I hope some journalists were using them before. I mean, not understanding what people are Googling, which is just a site that we're all on every day. So not understanding that more in depth seems a little ignorant if you're completely missing out on all of these tools. Google Maps, everybody uses this. Google Earth, I'm sure we've all been on Street View once or twice. These are all things that I think the average internet user is using anyway. And I think having a workshop on it, using it, and then I think also being very open about what is still not working or what Google needs to be more transparent on. I don't see how that's can't see you anymore, but I don't see how that's necessarily clouding our judgment. So, and most of the people, especially, I'm someone scouting for these kinds of innovations and tools. I'm not reporting on any of these businesses. So basically, trying to bring in people to inspire some of our journalists and our editors to then use them. I'm not concurrently, simultaneously reporting on Google actually. So I'm trying to find the best tools and offering them to our journalists, and then they can decide which ones to use. I mean, there are so many open tools out there. I feel like it would be ignorant to completely miss out on a range that this company too is offering. but I can be, I can repeat a lot of the criticisms that I still have. I do think there needs to be more transparency about where the separation lies between Google Search, Google AdSense, all of these, the revenue-driven parts of Google. And I do think there can be a lot more freedom that can be given to the newsrooms so as to not make it look so uniformly googly in the end.
That's good feedback. Anyone with a last burning question? If not, I'd just like please thank our panel. Okay.